I found the cheapest mechanical keyboard on Temu to see if it is any good and in order to budgetly modify it. All in all, it costed me $5, delivery included with taxes and everything else, so let's see if this keyboard is decent for its price. The package is what you'd expect in this price point. That's a standard cardboard box with included keyboard, keycap plus switch puller, additional keycaps for some reason for 100% keyboard despite this keyboard being 60%, and the cable for the keyboard itself. Stock, this keyboard sounds pretty decent as you would hear in a minute, but of course I will modify it the cheapest way possible in order to get the best out of this $5 keyboard. The features of this keyboard are pretty minimal. That's backlight, white-ish with the blue tint, no RGB here. Of course there's backlighting, it has different options of animation, so different effects. I don't know for what reason do you need it if this keyboard is non-RGB, but it exists, so thank you for this. Of course it has some type of switches. I have chosen the linear red switches, some generic ones. The keyboard is 60% and USB only. So you have detachable USB Type-C cable, so you can use any cable you'd like if it is USB Type-C, since the cable which comes out of the box is not a very good quality. It's okay, but nothing fancy here. Also, as mentioned before, this keyboard is 60% keyboard, which were popular back in the day, but right now the market is being dominated by TKL or 75% keyboards. But for this price, it's pretty difficult to argue about the price and the keyboard itself. So the question is, where did they have cut any cost? First of all, the cutting corner was with the packaging. The package, standard card box, no fancy shiny box right here, standard card box with as minimal packaging as possible. Next thing is the absence of Phillips stand, so you cannot adjust the angle of your keyboard, as for example can be done with my Royal Clutch keyboard, which has detachable magnetic stands in order to change the angle of the keyboard. Next thing, as mentioned before, here is no RGB keyboard, so it only has bluish, whitish backlight color, which I suppose meant to be white, but for some reason it's blue. Of course, as mentioned before, it has some sort of animations, but I suppose that the most useful type of backlight would be a standard non-animated light, because animation without RGB doesn't make much sense. Of course, next thing are keycaps. The keycaps are shine-through, but it is ABS keycaps. But of course you have additional keycaps for the keyboard, but for some reason, as I said before, it counts for 100% keyboard, 100% layout of the keyboard, so not all of the keycaps will be useful for this 60% keyboard. Next thing is the build quality of this keyboard. This keyboard has minimal amount of thing which you need to name it keyboard. It has keycaps, it has switches, it has the body and PCB, and that's pretty much it. Of course, the build quality is pretty decent, pretty sturdy body of the keyboard, no different type of flexing, no different type of squeaking. But of course you do not have any type of sound dampening here, like for example foam or even the same standard tape mod. But of course I will modify this keyboard just in a minute. Next thing is that this keyboard is wired only. Of course, as I said before, it has detachable USB Type-C cable, so you are free to choose any cable of your liking if it is USB Type-C. But it would be nice to see a wireless keyboard, but for this price point it's difficult to argue that the battery in this keyboard would just make the price go higher. So wired keyboard for this price point, perfect. Of course, the next thing is the cheap cable which comes out of the box, but as mentioned before, you are free to choose any cable of your liking. Next thing is the 60% layout of the keyboard. The thing is that it uses much less materials than, for example, TKL or 75% keyboard or 100% layout of the keyboard, so 60% keyboard uses much less materials than other ones. But now let's dive into the modding this keyboard, as budget modding as possible. So essentially what I will use tape modification, some type of foam modification, and change of the keycaps for this keyboard without touching the switches. So the switches are, as I said before, linear red switches, so they are pretty okay for this price point. Of course, they are not looped, the stamps are not looped, and I will not do that since we are going to the as budget modification as possible, just to slightly increase the quality of sound which this keyboard produces. So first of all, we need to disassemble this keyboard. This keyboard can be disassembled pretty easily, it has several screws, so the top of this keyboard comes relatively easily, and you see the PCB with undetachable USB Type-C, so no ribbon here, so you have no chance of tearing it off. So essentially the first modification, as mentioned before, will be the tape modification. So all you need to have is a tape, scissors, and will to do it. So it takes literally a minute, and straight after that we are going to the second type of modification, which will be foam modification. Of course, if we will be making a custom keyboard, custom very high profile keyboard in terms of cost, in that case I would use some type of specific foam or some silicone dampening, but here, since we are getting modifications for $5 keyboard, we're going to use as cheapest materials as possible. For example, for this so-called foam modification, I will use the foam which comes straight out of the box with this keyboard, actually the foam which was used to wrap this keyboard around. So I have used the double layer of this foam, I have put it simply just to the under of the keyboard and have cut the holes for the screws in order to assemble this keyboard once again. And of course, last but not least, is to change the keycaps from pretty cheap shine through ABS keycaps to the PBT keycaps. For this purpose I will use keycaps from other keyboard, and as ironically as it would be, this set of keycaps costs essentially more than the keyboard itself. But of course, if you do not have any, the standard keycaps will be quite okay for some time. But since we are getting to the modifications of this keyboard, let's compare the sound of this completely modified keyboard with Royal Clutch 1, also with the red linear switches. But the keyboard Royal Clutch, my first keyboard which I use as a mechanical one for gaming primarily, it costs 20 times more, so around $100. It is wireless keyboard, it has red linear switches, and I have used it before just for gaming, since I use membrane keyboard and vertical mouse for productivity work. As you can see in my previous video, the hint will be in the upper right corner of the video on YouTube. So the question is this keyboard any good? For this price point, it's an amazing choice for you to have as the first mechanical keyboard, as a keyboard to try modifying without fear of breaking it since the price is simply ridiculously low. But as I have seen before on the same Temu, it doesn't cost $5 now. I was just lucky to get it for $5. Right now it costs somewhere in between of 20 and 30 bucks. So for this price point, this keyboard is a little bit of questionable choice, but still you won't get anything from the major gaming brands, gaming peripherals for this price point. So essentially, as the first mechanical keyboard, it's simply amazing since it has hot swappable switches, since it has pretty simple PCB, and simply great possibility for modification in any way you'd like. So as a first keyboard, it's okay, it's simply amazing choice. If you would like to have some 60% keyboard for your collection, it will be also okay since you can use it as a PCB just to make a custom keyboard right from scratch, because for this price you wouldn't get even some PCBs right now. In terms of sound, this keyboard sounds decent. Of course you wouldn't get any talky sound straight out of this keyboard, especially if we're talking before modification, but there is still very big room for modding, very big room for changing switches, for changing keycaps, for modifications as with foam, with tape, with silicone, whatever you'd like. So as DIY project, it's simply an amazing choice, especially if you would get it for less than $20.